Today's lesson is called Summarizing Bivariate Categorical Data with Relative Frequencies. So in example 1, we're extending the frequency table to a relative frequency table. Determining the number of students in each cell presents the first step in organizing bivariate categorical data. Another way of analyzing the data in the table is to calculate what's called the relative frequency for each cell. Relative frequencies relate each frequency count to the total number of observations. For each cell in this table, the relative frequency of a cell is found by dividing the frequency of that cell by the total number of responses. So I'm going to highlight that there. Okay. So that's important. As numbers are in the table, they could be misleading because let's say to fly, 49 females chose that out of 228. Whereas if I had a 49 in another category for males, only 222 males were surveyed. So the reason we make a relative frequency is to give it all basically an even playing field so then we can see what the statistics are actually telling us. So consider the two-way frequency table from the previous lesson. That would be the one with gender and superpower. This was the two-way frequency table that we created last time. All the numbers have been filled in for you. The relative frequency table would be found by dividing each of the above cell values by 450. So for example, the relative frequency of females selecting to fly. So that would be right here, 49, is going to be compared to the total of all totals, which is this number, 450. So you're going to do 49 over 450, and then you are going to create a decimal. And here they're asking us to go to the nearest thousandth. Okay, so for to fly, 49 out of 450, if you do that on your calculator, it's approximately 0.109 to the nearest thousandth. A few of the other relative frequencies to the nearest thousandths are shown in the relative frequency table. So let's look at the other one, another one they gave us here, males and invisibility. So if I look at males and visibility, it's 27. So you can see they took that number, 27, put it over 450, use their calculator to get that as a decimal, and rounded to the nearest thousandth. So that created the decimal 0.060. If we look at the total for freeze time, the total for freeze time is 131. So again, that's in the numerator position compared to the total of all totals, which is 450. When you divide those and change it into a decimal and go to the nearest thousandth, you get 0.291. So they also did that for the total for telepathy or telepathy and also for the total for females. So let's do one more live in action here so you can see what you should have chosen. Let's do freeze time for females. So if I look at freeze time for females, that's a total of 60. That becomes the numerator. The denominator is our total surveyed, so that's 450. Then I would go on my calculator and divide those two values. So I would do 60 divided by 450, and I get 0.13333 repeating. Now remember, we want to go to the nearest thousandth, so that would be 3 decimal places, which would be 0.133. So we do the approximately sign because we're rounding. It would be 0.133. Let's do super strength for males. Super strength for males. So if I find males, super strength, that's 25. I would put 25 in the numerator. The total of 450 would go on the bottom, and then we would find out approximately to the nearest thousandth or 3 decimal places what that would give us. So I would do 25 divided by the 450, and I see I get 0.05555 repeating, and you're going to see a 6 at the end only because we're running out of space. So they round up at that very last interval. But again, we're going to the nearest third decimal place, nearest thousandth. So the 5 next to it is going to make that bump up. So we would have 0.056. So 0.056. So now that you've seen several examples, what I'd like you to do is pause the video. And what you're going to do is actually be answering exercise 1 on your own. It says calculate the remaining relative frequencies in the table above. We have done some. You're going to fill in the rest of the blanks. Write the value in the table as a decimal rounded to the nearest thousandth. So at this time, I'd like you to pause the video, complete the rest of the relative frequency table, then resume to go over the answers. All right, now that you've had time to fill in the frequency table, let's go over your answers. I just want to say in general again, all numerators. So if I go through here and I mark all numerators that I filled in, all of these numbers that I'm circling all came from our two-way table, and they go in the numerator position. The number in the denominator was your total people surveyed. So that was 450. All decimals should have been to 3 decimal places, which is the nearest thousandth. I do want to point out one box in particular. This box right here, we know 450 is the total of all totals. So if you've done this correctly, this box should equal 1 to account for all of the people in the survey. Okay? Now at this time, if your teacher has left an activity for you to do for the remaining questions for practice, you are all done with this video and you should go complete that practice activity. If not, or if you need further assistance after completing the practice, from this point on, we will go over the answers to questions 2 through 10 of the rest of the lesson. So looking at questions 2 through 10, 2 says, based on previous work with frequency tables, which cells in this table would represent the joint relative frequencies? You should have referred back to the previous lesson for your definitions. These are the unshaded cells that make up the body of the table, so that kind of middle section. Number 3, which cells in the relative frequency table would represent the marginal relative frequencies? Shaded cells in the total row and the total column. So remember, this is the outside of the table. Again, refer back to your previous day's notes. Number 4, what is the joint relative frequencies for female and invisibility? You would use your relative frequency table to locate that and then interpret the meaning of it. So what does it mean in our situation? So it was 0.107, which is about 10.7%. Remember to change a decimal to a percent. You multiply by 100, which means you move the decimal place 2 places to the right. So that tells me about 10.7% of the students sampled were females who selected invisibility as their power. Number 5, what is the marginal relative frequency for freeze time? So in number 4, it was in the body of the table. In number 5, it was around the edge. So again, interpret the meaning. It was 0.291, which is approximately 29.1%. So 29.1% of all students surveyed, since it was a marginal frequency of totals, show that students selected freeze time. In number 6, what is the difference? Difference means to subtract in the joint relative frequencies for males and for females who selected to fly as their favorite superpower. So we're going to subtract them here. We get 0.004, which is about 0.4%. That's super duper small. So there's not really a noticeable difference here because of that. And then number 7, is there a noticeable difference between the genders and their favorite superpowers? So what you should have done for this question is go back and test out some more numbers like you did in number 6. See if there's really a difference between the males and the females. So for some of them there was not, like in number 6, and for some of them there were. So I would say yes within only the categories of invisibility, super strength, and telepathy or telepathy. Now moving on for the last several questions, example 2 says interpreting data. Interest in superheroes continues at Rufus King High School. The students who analyzed the data in the previous lesson decided to create a comic strip for the school website that involves a superhero. They thought the summaries developed from the data would be helpful in designing the comic strip. Only one power will be given to the superhero. A debate arose as to what power the school superhero would possess. Students used the two-way frequency table and the relative frequency table to continue the discussion. Take another look at those tables. So hopefully you did that. Scott initially indicated that the character created should have super strength as the special power. This suggestion was not well received by the other students planning this project. In particular, Jill argued, well, if you don't want to ignore more than half of the readers, then I suggest telepathy or telepathy is the better power for our character. So in exercises 8 through 10, Scott acknowledged that super strength was probably not the best choice based on the data. The data indicates that freeze time is the most popular power for a superhero. Continued Scott. Jill, however, still did not agree with Scott that this was a good choice. She argued that telepathy or telepathy was a better choice. So question 8, how does the data support Scott's claim? Why do you think he selected freeze time as the special power for the comic strip hero? So he selected freeze time since it was the most popular among all students. So Scott was looking at the totals, all students at 29.1% for freeze time. When you look at how the data is supported by Jill's claim here, why do you think she selected telepathy or telepathy? Is because if you look among only the female row, that is the most popular choice. Then in number 10, of the two special powers, freeze time and telepathy or telepathy, you have to select the one you think would be the better choice based on the data. So that would be freeze time, since overall it is the best choice among males and females, because remember, this is going to be for the entire class. That's going to include both. So it's best to use what's best overall to address the class. And this concludes your lesson on summarizing bivariate categorical data with relative frequencies.